Yeah, I think this is a real, in the software world, I think it's a really interesting trend that there are all these components available that you can, and this is what we did with Tynax actually. We built it, we didn't bring any outside funding in, we built this thing, got some great engineers, and we built a platform, and basically for the last 5 years we've been profitable with positive cash flow from day one. And it was, we leveraged the latest tools that were available to build really advanced technology by combining components. So I think, I'm not going to talk too much about the technology aspect, and these guys know a lot more than I do, but the fact that you can build software by combining these pieces together means the cost point is much lower. And I think that creates a hole in the market for software companies that are too small for the VCs, but they only need $500,000 or angel-sized funding to get going. And I think we need to rethink the way those companies are kind of financed and started up. And we need to throw away the preferred stock model, and we need to really change and think about those companies should be oriented toward building hot new products that they can supply to eBay, Google, and those guys that then they can deliver through their channels. So I think there's a real opportunity there in that low end of the market that's created by the interoperability and these building blocks.
I just had a couple thoughts. I agree with everything that's been said. Given that one of the key issues that you guys are bringing up is the changing cost structure, namely the drastically lowering startup costs, one of the key questions around software is, how, with a startup of that sort or any sort of company in the space, are you going to build sustainable competitive advantage? Because startup cost is not going to be one. And so that's that's kind of a key industry structure question just for any perspective for startup. Is it going to be brand? Is it going to be network effect? Is it going to be something around data, et cetera, et cetera? That's one of the interesting questions that gets raised by the changing economics of this space.
So I'm going to take a page out of Mark's book. I have nothing to add to that. I think it's been pretty well covered. But I will add one thing. It's kind of to what Erik was saying. It's really changing the business model of how we think about a startup, how we think about starting up a function and starting up a business. And I'm sure some of the other folks here on the panel can talk to this much more than I can. But just even beyond software, how you start and how quickly you can start, and reducing that cycle time from idea and concept to actually having a product and having customers is shrinking significantly. And so that cycle time shrinkage is going to be a key factor, I think, as we start to move forward, start thinking about software and solving some of those problems that Mark talked about.
The one thing I would add to that is, we talked about the product side, but if you actually look at the sales side, I tell you, the last 4 or 5 true infrastructure software companies that I've seen have all come with models that are either open source or have a free 30-day downloadable software package that you can try and buy. And it literally is, and their sales and marketing isn't your traditional Oracle sales guy or Cisco sales guy. It's AdWords, AdSense. I mean, it is an online, and the first sales hire they make, or sales and marketing hire, is an online marketing person. And it's amazing to see, I think besides the product side, the sales side has changed dramatically, and that's really exciting to us because you can build companies for a lot less capital, and you can get, like Tim said, get started a lot quicker. And a lot of times in conjunction with building out, the product, they're building out their online marketing channels, which is pretty interesting.
Hi, my name is Amy Freeman. I have a question going back to the intellectual property discussion. If the value of IP for an entrepreneur is essentially the right to operate, right? From my perspective, it's right to operate. And I can't really pursue that given the comments mentioned before about needing a certain amount of capital to protect it. Do open source licenses offer entrepreneurs some protection to operate? And how do they stack up against the patents that we've traditionally looked at for that venue. Do you understand the question? In other words, is there an open source strategy for an entrepreneur that could secure right to operate without demanding a $5 million capital protection investment as noted before? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. If you're looking at it there though from the position of potential defendant, right? So you're developing software and you're worried about being accused of infringing someone else's patents, right?
No, actually the opposite. I'm protecting my right to operate.
So that's your right to operate.
Well,
yeah.
both ways. Yeah.
Okay, right. So yeah, I mean basically, if you are infringing someone else's patent, if you're using their invention without a license, then you're infringing and you're liable to pay them. And there's no way around it. There's no protection license you can get. There is a large company being set up called Intellectual Ventures that's gone out and bought about 50,000 patents in the last few years. If you get a license from them, you might be well protected. But other than that, open source has its own kind of licensing arrangements, and there's special rules. So open source, you generally look maybe well, it provides some protection, but it's still liable for. But the best defense you have is that you're small. You're too small a target. No one's going to spend $5 million bringing a lawsuit against you if you're small enough. So when you have deep pockets, that you suddenly become a target. So yeah, I think the best thing to do is, if you're a small startup company, don't worry about being the subject of an infringement lawsuit yourself, and until you have some serious. This is what we see: is that companies get to a certain size where they suddenly become a target. When they become a target, what they do then is they buy patents that the other companies are infringing. So they got some ammunition to throw back. And they don't really care about whether the patents cover their own products. They want something to be able to throw back in a countersuit to try and, have something to bargain with. So it gets to be an interesting game.
Were you asking in that direction, or were you saying to
Actually,
establish IP to protect your own? So the thing is, I guess I would quibble with your phrasing. I wouldn't say that you need that $5 million as a right to operate. I mean, you have the right to operate. The thing that the $5 million may be required to do is, as you were saying earlier, it may be required to protect you against someone else who will undercut your pricing or something like that, right? You can operate. It's just that the monetization could be a problem if someone steals your IP. That's a separate question, and it depends on what world you're in, and if you're in a world where you have those $5 million, or if you're not, can you come up with, as I said before, some other source of sustainable competitive advantage that you can use to monetize. And in some worlds that can be some IP, but that will be more expensive. In other worlds, you're going to have to find something else.
Yeah, and I think the second part of your question was around open source, and you have to be very, very careful there. I mean, it's so easy to say, let me go get some open source. Most software companies that I know now are taking open source components off the shelf and putting it in there. And we just sold a company last quarter to Microsoft, and that sale process took about 4 or 5 months, and they went through every line of code. They had us pull out all the open source components. Of course, they're Microsoft on the other end of the spectrum. But the reality is that you need to look very carefully at all the licensing around open source before you start. I would say using it. You can use the components, but when you start modifying stuff, that's when you get into trouble. And if you modify open source and you create your own forks, and you start distributing this, there's a lot of liability involved. And you got an expert in the room, you might have a couple experts in the room, but the reality is you have to be very careful when you use. It's not just simple to just take the open source component, modify it, and start using it. Just be careful about that when you build it up.
And I'll second the statement. I'll say that if you actually get to the point where you're thinking about doing a deal, kind of sloppiness, significant sloppiness around that sort of thing is one of the most common, really serious red flags that could pop up, along with serious accounting irregularities or something like that.